In sharp contrast to all other potential superpowers covered in this series, the European Union is not a nation-state, but rather a supranational organization. This means that it's essentially a collection of nations that hold very strong economic and political ties without any of the member states being forced to give up their own national autonomy. As stated, there were talks of creating a United States of Europe, a federal republic similar to the United States, becoming a sovereign nation. But this idea was quickly taken back behind the shed and murdered. A few centuries of nationalism strengthened people's identities into their nation-states, oftentimes in direct opposition to the nationalism of other sovereign states. Furthermore, the two most important continental powers were still wary of each other. The horrors of both world wars and the jingoism that accompanied them had made many Europeans consider European unification. This sentiment was not pervasive enough to dismantle each nation's national sovereignty, though. So, by taking the middle ground of adopting a supranational organization, this required creating a complex system of bureaucracy. And holy f***, it's complicated. I won't be able to give a comprehensive overview of how the EU works, lest this video becomes a couple years long. Plus, it will be really fucking boring. So here's a disgustingly oversimplified overview. The most important characteristic of the EU's institutions is that there are numerous ones of them, and they're located in different cities across the continent. This is done to make sure that no one institution or nation state within the EU holds too much power. The EU gets much of its budget from its member dues, thereby distributing its dependency on all member states to varying degrees. There is no single leader of the EU. Rather than consolidating power in one person or body, there are 7 institutions, the 3 most important of which are the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council of the European Union. Keep in mind that that last one, the Council of the European Union, should not be confused with the 4th institution called the European Council, which has a similar name and same logo. Bureaucrats are not famed for their imagination or creativity. The European Commission is located in Brussels and is arguably the most important. It's the executive body that proposes laws. Every member country has its own commission. Each commissioner here is sworn to uphold the interests of the EU as a whole over their home nations. This is done to promote collective security and prosperity across the board, but many see it as a challenge to the national sovereignty of each state. The European Parliament is also located in Brussels, but also Strasbourg, France. You might be asking why an inefficient system of moving between 2 cities over and over again is in place, and the answer is, France said so. The Parliament meets 12 times per year, and has members totaling 700, who vote on various laws. Every 5 years, EU citizens vote for their representatives. This makes the European Parliament the most democratic of all institutions within the European Union. If a country, say Spain, is a member state, which it indeed is, then all Spanish citizens get EU citizenship and so forth. Trying to form a body of representation for nearly 500 million people in nearly 30 countries is no easy task. Each member state has its own voting system and manages their representatives differently. Italy, for example, has representatives from different sub-territories of Italy, while France has representatives that represent the entire nation as a collective. Now for the Council of the European Union. This body is made up of ministers from different countries that hold similar roles. This usually involves bodies that cover major policy issues such as the environment, defense, healthcare, and etc. And they will amend and adopt laws related to specific issues. I did mention the European Council, which, I will repeat again, is different from the Council of the European Union. This usually involves heads of state meeting up to discuss high-level issues. There is also a European Court of Justice, which is kind of like their version of the Supreme Court, along with the Court of Auditors and a central bank. After hearing all of this, you won't be surprised that former Secretary of State and war criminal Kissinger supposedly asked, "Who do I call when I want to call Europe?" This unending complexity is part of the reason why many Europeans see the EU as a soulless bureaucracy, far cut up in its own red tape to properly address the own needs of its citizens. Nonetheless, being a member does have its perks. For example, there is greater freedom of movement and freedom to work across much of the EU, with some stipulations. This ease of labor movement creates very strong economic interdependency, not to mention creating stronger social bonds between peoples of different nations. That makes countries less likely to go to war with each other. There's also a sector of Europe called the Schengen region. It essentially operates without borders or customs. It facilitates the efficient movement of goods, services, people, and ideas across borders, strengthening the EU's mark on the continent. There are some exceptions to this. Ireland is part of the EU, but not the Schengen region, as it's an island nation with its own set of concerns of security and economic customs. Switzerland, on the other hand, is not part of the EU, but is part of the Schengen region, even though it staunchly opposes EU membership. Over the past decade, the EU has become embroiled in numerous political crises. This is on top of numerous economic crises, which we will discuss later on in the video. One recent social crisis has been the European migrant crisis, starting in 2015. Numerous tumultuous events in the Middle East and Africa have caused massive waves of refugees and economic migrants to enter Europe via the Mediterranean Sea or Turkey. The two biggest contributors were most likely climate change, which hit agricultural workers in the developing world very hard, along with war refugees, particularly from Syria, during the height of ISIS's rampage. Many Western nations, namely Germany and Sweden, opened their borders up to large swaths of Syrian migrants. Many Eastern European nations were far more reluctant to let refugees enter from the Middle East and Africa. Aside from moral reasons, some provide practical reasons, such as the need for immigration due to lower birth rates in many European countries and a need for a cheap labor force. Critics, however, argue that the number of migrants was unsustainable, and much of the reason for doing this was built on German collective guilt and white guilt in general. On the other hand, critics are concerned over security and national identity. The past 2 decades have seen a number of Islamic terrorist attacks, most notably the Paris attack in 2015. Other high-profile attacks include the Madrid train bombings in the 2000s, along with the London bus bombings, attacks on the Brussels airport later on, and the Charlie Hebdo shooting, among many others. These attacks and instability have fostered anti-Muslim sentiment in the region, which has turned to an increased popularity of nationalist and far-right groups. There has also been a recurring issue of trying to assimilate migrants that come from very conservative religious backgrounds in a largely democratically liberal and secular Europe. While non-European Western nations like the US, Canada, and Australia have been very successful in assimilating immigrants due to their histories being a result of large-scale migration, many European nations were founded on ethnic lines and languages. Others have voiced concern over how migration from Muslim-majority countries may affect women, Jewish minorities, and the LGBT community. Critics of these arguments point out that the vast majority of migrants do not commit crimes. They will further argue that much of the opposition to immigration is rooted in xenophobia and racism. Others counter-argue that the woke intersectional left, which has come to dominate many cultural institutions, most notably the media, has been grossly hypocritical. This is because there seems to be an incongruency between supporting women's rights and LGBT rights on one hand, and on the other hand, bringing people from a culture that is far more conservative. The refugee crisis, coupled with economic instability, has promoted the rise of far-right groups, most of which harbor deep anti-EU sentiment. This started before the refugee crisis. Greece, for example, saw the rise of the Golden Dawn Party. While flagrant neo-Nazi ideology has not fared well in the long term, nationalist populists with anti-immigration and anti-EU proposals did. Some of these governments have violated EU law by consolidating too much power within their own borders, the most notable ones being Hungary and Poland. The current governments have engaged in extensive excessive influence on courts and independent institutions. There have also been calls in the EU for the suspension of using voting rights and cutting EU funding, of which both nations benefit disproportionately from. In 2017, the European Commission initiated Article 7 against Poland. Article 7 was created to prevent member states from implementing undemocratic policies, namely in national courts. This process has been ongoing, both in Parliament and the European Council. EU members have to unanimously vote to implement sanctions. Hungary has also been under fire for undemocratic policies, and has promised to veto any action against Poland. The most notable example of anti-EU sentiment is of course Brexit. The UK has a long history of Euroscepticism that has crossed ideological lines over decades. The UK in many ways holds closer ties with the United States and the Commonwealth nations that were once part of its empire. Many in the UK see the EU as a threat to British sovereignty. There have also been concerns over immigration, not just from the Middle East, but also from EU members such as Poland. Those in favor of staying point to the enormous economic benefits of being tied to the EU markets, as well as the freedom of its citizens to move. The referendum was one of the most polarizing in the nation's modern history. Older and rural voters were more likely to support leaving, while the youth vote and urbanites were in favor of staying. Scotland was heavily in favor of staying as well. Nonetheless, Brexit won by a razor-thin margin. This was a major hit to the EU, as it meant its third largest member state was leaving. This boosted the nationalists in other European countries and even the United States. By this point, the UK has already left, and some predict that Scotland and possibly Northern Ireland may leave the UK and join the EU. Others argue that other Eurosceptic nations like Denmark will follow the UK's lead. While these political issues are unlikely to lead to a dismantling of the EU altogether, they do damper some of the superorganization's ability to operate as a superpower. Now that we've gotten the political matters out of the way, let's move on to the military issues. The EU does not have a major military wing, and while there is a common security and defense policy that manages crises, such as collective defense, its military footprint is drafted up by another organization, NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is a military alliance composed of most European nations, as well as the US and Canada, and Turkey. Most EU nations are in NATO and vice versa, however there are some exceptions. For example, Turkey and Norway are in NATO but not in the EU, while Sweden and Finland are in the EU but not in NATO. NATO was first set up to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. In recent years, that last part has been fairly irrelevant. Germany has done a very good job at not causing another major war since World War II. NATO's primary function today is provide collective security and defense for its member states, primarily under the threat of Russian expansion. Since the US is the greatest power in the organization, this means that much of Europe's military protection is placed in the hands of Washington, and NATO officials rather than EU officials. This maintains American hegemony over the military affairs of the region, and the United States holds several military bases in the region. Proponents of these bases see them as a joint benefit to both the US and European nations in the face of Russian threats. But critics say the bases are a drain on American resources and reduce the sovereignty of those said European nations. So right off the bat, the EU doesn't hold any significant military might, which is unsurprising since part of the reason why the EU exists in the first place is to prevent the outbreak of a continental war. Nonetheless, many major European powers have very formidable militaries, such as Italy, France, and Germany. France in particular even has nuclear weapons. While Germany has a very strong military tradition and is a major arms exporter, its political culture and general population is rather hesitant to engage in overseas military expeditions, given their less than stellar track record on the subject of military interventions abroad. Germany has also been more cautious while engaging with Russia, unlike the US, as Germans are dependent on Russian natural gas exports. Many Europeans see themselves as being more peaceful than their American and Russian counterparts. While there is some element of truth to this, many would argue that European nations still engage in numerous military expeditions, and that much of their diplomatic power relies on being teamed up with the military power of the United States. It's also kind of weird to claim that you're more peaceful than all the other powers when you guys spent half a millennia conquering every patch of grass on fucking Earth. Due to this existing system, it is unlikely that the EU will become an undisputed military power anytime soon. European security is heavily tied to the United States. The US maintains very close ties with the EU and unparalleled cooperation on military, political, and economic affairs under the ideology of Atlanticism. which is the position that close relations between the US and Europe are integral to global security, even if sometimes both sides resent the relationship with one another. This system has worked in preventing both an invasion by Russia as well as any major conflicts in Western Europe since World War II. That was until the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Now, this is an ongoing conflict as the making of this video, so I don't want to dwell too much into it. But while neither Russia or Ukraine are part of the EU, this has had devastating consequences to security on the European continent. Most EU countries have been very supportive of Ukraine, particularly those in Eastern Europe, who have also been subjugated by Russia in the past. However, Germany, for example, has been rather dependent on Russian oil and gas. France also tends to be a little bit more independent. This has led a rift within the West in general, with the Anglophone countries that are not part of the EU, along with the Eastern European countries that are part of the EU, having a bit of a fissure with Germany and France over their somewhat lenient stance on Russia. However, make no mistake, there have been some changes. Germany vastly ramped up its military spending in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Furthermore, historically neutral EU countries like Sweden and Finland have joined the US-based NATO alliance. This will probably lead to more and more Western solidarity. However, we have to wait and see whether the EU will create its own integrated military force. Let's move on to a less depressing topic for a moment: European technology. Europe unfortunately plays a secondary role in information technology around the world. Sure, some countries like Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands do have a lot of innovation when it comes to manufacturing, agriculture, and automotive industries, but when it comes to information technology, the EU in general tends to lag behind, even those at the top. By and large, American and Asian companies tend to outperform European ones. There is no European version of Google or Apple or Amazon. By and large, most European IT innovation comes in the form of secondary apps, such as Spotify from Sweden, Skype from Estonia, or Angry Birds. Now, I have nothing against Angry Birds, but it's not quite as important as Amazon or Google. China also beats Europe in this. China's state capitalism model has made it a very pressing force in technological innovation. And European countries oftentimes get beaten out by Japanese and South Korean companies as well. Some argue that this is due to the excessive bureaucracy and the lack of coordination of EU countries on the issue of technology. Furthermore, a lot of the best and brightest Europeans in the tech world tend to immigrate to the United States, leading to brain drain. Now moving on to Europe's economy. It's worth noting that there are some countries such as Iceland and Norway, which are part of the European Economic Area but not the EU. Their citizens can live and work in the EU, their governments pay dues, but they can't vote. This arrangement gives these outlier nations more control over certain sectors of the economy, such as fishing and oil. Norway, for example, has a lot of oil that makes them a ton of money that they would not like to share with anyone in Brussels. The euro is the second most traded currency after the US dollar. The organization's monetary policy is set up by the European Central Bank, which maintains price stability, conducts foreign exchange operations, and is the only entity allowed to issue euro banknotes. The bank has shareholders and stock, but is still beholden to EU law directly. Contrary to popular belief, not all EU countries are in the Eurozone, but most are. One issue has come about around the past few decades has been the European debt crisis, which hit Southern Europe the hardest, most notably Greece, which has a debt over 180% of its economy. This probably shouldn't have happened since EU member states must meet a certain set of criteria in terms of economic development and financial solvency, which Greece really didn't live up to. Greece, along with Portugal, Italy, Ireland, and Spain, made up the Pigs country, a flattering name for mostly southern European nations that have been unable to repay their debt or bail out their critically indebted banks. There is no complete consensus as to what caused the euro crisis. Some point to the core issue that the euro has been set up as an overreaching monetary system for currency over the continent, despite having vastly different systems of monetary policy between each country. Many blame austerity, the policy of cutting government spending, as the problem. Many, on the other hand, blame the reckless spending of governments like Greece. Others blame the banks for financial mismanagement. Others blame the Illuminati. Regardless of the cause of this crisis, it has placed a damper on the European project and has strengthened nationalistic fervor. Putting debt aside, the EU holds massive and complex trade relations with the US, China, Russia, Japan, Canada, India, and various non-EU nations in Europe such as Switzerland, Turkey, and Norway. As a whole, Europe has lower levels of income inequality when compared to other powers like the US, India, and Russia, possibly due to most nations have effective progressive tax systems and larger welfare states. However, the EU does struggle with GDP per capita disparity between nations, with North and Western Europe significantly being richer than nations of Eastern and to a lesser extent Southern Europe. Some nations such as Bulgaria have a GDP per capita as low as 20,000. This disparity has made it difficult to integrate various nations at different stages of economic development. This issue has come up in news repeatedly, particularly over relations between Germany and Greece. With Europe being part of the developed world, the economy is largely post-industrial. Granted, some nations like Germany have done a far better job than others in retaining manufacturing jobs. Today, the EU is predominantly a service sector economy, with most workers commuting to jobs in retail or offices. When assessing the EU's economy and how it will impact the supranational organization's potential for being a superpower, the results are rather mixed. Europe remains one of the most prosperous regions, with an exceptionally high standard of living. Regardless of this, the EU's potential as a global economic power is reliant on its own economic integration, and the path to integration has hit numerous speed bumps in a very short period of time. In many ways, the EU's core political vulnerability and economic vulnerability reinforce each other. The main political vulnerability is that national identities take precedent over the greater European project, making economic management very difficult. This reinforces the disparity between monetary and fiscal policy, as well as the chasms that exist between the richest nations in the EU and the poorest. The lack of political cohesion continues to be an issue. For example, New York State has a massive economy and a high GDP per capita. On the other hand, Mississippi is the poorest state in the United States and gets more from the federal government than it returns, effectively freeloading off of states like New York and California. However, since American identity is firmly situated in the existence of a federal republic and civic nationalism, thus state allegiances are far weaker. Most New Yorkers don't really create much of a fuss about giving money to Mississippians. This is not the case in Europe. While West Germans had fairly successfully integrated with East Germany, this is because Germans are, well, Germans, not Greeks. Unless these issues get resolved, the EU will most likely continue to struggle, given the rise of nationalist parties, many of whom are critical of the EU project as a whole. This will throw up future military and political integration, both of which are contingent on American support currently. Furthermore, since American hard power and European soft power are interconnected, much of Europe's strength on the world stage, as much as they would hate to admit, is somewhat reliant on American power. And if American power declines, so too will the might of the European Union decline. So will the EU remain as a major force on the global stage? Almost certainly yes. Will it transform into a true nation state and rise to be the world's greatest superpower? Well, I'm not sure about that. Regardless of its future, what I am sure about is that the EU has succeeded in its original goal, preventing the outbreak of war between its own borders. And nothing else will solidify Europe's continuing influence on the world stage than its own security and stability. So tell me what you guys think, especially if you're from one of the EU member states. I want to hear your thoughts. Bye.